All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am here with three philosophy nerds who are not only fellow friends with Tom Oord like myself, but people not wonderfully thrilled with divine omnipotence for a whole host of reasons, many of which get explored in Tom's new book, The Death of Omnipotence. Now, you have to admit the gra- the cover here, Tom, is intense. If you wave it in front of the wrong Calvinist, it makes them flinch. Um, but we're real excited here. It obviously the book just came out, so we aren't going to be expecting at a book release party for everyone to have read the book. Though there were two people that read it and sent in a question, which I have to say,
Oh, excellent.
I guess we're not trying to talk them into buying a copy of the book, but what we're going to do is one up front. Tom will share the big idea of the book and stuff behind it. Then you'll hear from two of our philosopher friends here, Don and Donna, and then I got questions that start with each of them. And then the others talk and they'll go back and forth. And then any of you that are listening or those that did their prep work and read a book that's for a book release party and sending questions, I'll be answering those questions. So if you like Kyle on the YouTube, he dropped in and said, "Woohoo! Greetings from New Jersey," and we see there on Facebook, Bob is giving a nice shout from Northern Virginia. Well, in those very same places, you can also leave a question if you have one. Just put the word "question" up front, preferably in all caps, and then I'll star it and can save it. But we'll see, Tom. There were a number of people that said you're having a book release party on 420. How in the world are you planning on doing that late at night on 420? And I said, you forget he's Nazarene.
That's right.
He comes to Theology Beer Camp and he's like, do you brew tea? So,
Yep.
yeah. But so what we're going to do is we're going to let Tom kick things off. But remember, at any point in this, I might remind you multiple times, all the cool kids are going to go get themselves, their friend, and maybe their enemy a copy of the book. Though, if you're on there right now, I just got this new little contraption. So if somebody wants to check and see if it really works, the QR code, because otherwise I'll just be excited about the fact it was an option, but not know if someone scanned the QR code. It told me someone scanned it. Okay, now we'll find out if they actually get there to check the book out. But yeah, so it is good. I'm really excited for everyone to get to meet Don and Donna if you haven't interacted with them before. But first, I want to invite Tom to tell us a bit about his book, whatever way he would love to frame this evening, so that we can kick things off and get to know the text. So take it away,
Excellent.
Tom.
Hey, thanks so much, Trip, for hosting this. And as I thought about having a conversation about the new book, I thought what would be really ideal is if I got three experts in process thought, three people who have been influenced by the process tradition and have thought a great deal about omnipotence to get together and kind of work our way through some of the big issues. The process theological community and process theology in particular is confusing to a lot of people. And if you ask them what is process theology about is all about, oftentimes the answer you get doesn't at least find I don't find satisfying. Um, there's a lot of confusion. But if there is one thing that process theology seems to be known for, it's the denial of omnipotence. And that's at the heart of my new book, The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence. I've been writing about this issue for a while, but never really sort of hitting the omnipotence word head on. I've had a book called The Uncontrolling Love of God, another one called God Can't. And those books were really dealing with the questions of evil. That if there is a God who is able to control others, then why doesn't this God prevent the genuine evils of the world? And after God Can't came out, it was kind of a little joke in some circles to talk about all the things God can't do. And people said to me, well, what can God do? It was almost as if they thought they had to choose between an omnipotent God and an impotent God. And I thought, I really need to write a book that addresses the questions of omnipotence head on and offers a clear alternative to impotence. So, just to lay out the 4 chapters, and then I'd like to turn it over to Don to talk next. Um, Chapter 1 is a biblical chapter. I bring out my Greek and Hebrew that I had as a younger person. I've forgotten all my Hebrew, by the way, so I have to rely almost entirely on Hebrew scholars for this section, but I still remember some of my Greek. And I look at all of the times omnipotence or almighty appears in the Christian Bible. Hebrew scriptures, Greek scriptures. And of course, the word omnipotence is not found unless you're reading the Latin. If you're reading English, however, you'll find the word almighty in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And what I show in the book is that the word almighty is a mistranslation. It's based on a mistranslation of 2 Hebrew words, Shaddai, which is usually understood as breasts or mountains, and Sabaoth, which is understood as hosts or councils. So it's God of the breast or the Lord of the host. Neither one require one to think God is controlling, omnipotent, or almighty. But the story is that when Greek Jews translated in the scriptures into Greek in the 3rd and 4th century BCE, they chose a Greek word called pantocrator. Panto meaning all, crater meaning something like hold, so that God is all holding. Not a very good translation of the breasted God or the Lord of hosts, but this all holding word then becomes the way to talk about Sabaoth and Shaddai. When it comes time to write the New Testament, we don't find Pantocrator in Jesus's writings in his what was written about him, but we do find it once from the Apostle Paul when he's quoting the Septuagint, and 9 times in the Book of Revelation, which is pretty rare considering how much people think, at least in the Christian tradition, how often people associate God with Almighty. Those references to God as Almighty are not clear at all in what they mean. And I then make and then they're based on this mistranslation in the first place. So, my basic point in the first chapter is to say the biblical references to God as Almighty are mistranslations, and the meaning of the word doesn't appear in scriptures either. The second chapter is a philosophical one where I start with the classic question: can God make a rock so big that even God can't lift it? And I begin to explore all of the logical, ontological, mathematical kind of questions. Questions: can God change God's nature? Can a God who's omnipresent, decide not to be in Los Angeles? Those kinds of really interesting questions. And I note that both conservative and progressive thinkers throughout history have all admitted that God can't be omnipotent in a straightforward kind of way. The only way we can talk about God's power and omnipotence in any kind of way is to qualify it over and over. And so they'll say God can't make 2 plus 2 equal 397. God can't give free will, but also control others. All these kinds of things. And the main point of that chapter is that by the time we qualify omnipotence over and over and over and over again, I claim it dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. By which I mean, if it's qualified so many times, it loses its oomph. It loses its what's a good word? Well, it's dead by the end of the time we qualify it. Third chapter is a return to some of the questions of evil that I've addressed in the past in a little bit different kind of way. But also, I ask the question: if we think God is omnipotent, how does that affect the way we think about politics, leaders? If God is in control, doesn't that mean that all the bad leaders that are in history are either put in place by God, or at least God allows them to be ruthless dictators? And some of those dictators kind of figured that out theologically and used it to their advantage. That is, they claimed that God is put them into power. I think my favorite paragraph in that chapter, by the way, is when I talk about in the United States, when evangelicals claim that Donald Trump was placed in power by God because God is omnipotent. A lot of progressive Christians, of course, disagreed with them vehemently, but they continued to think God was omnipotent. And I think evangelicals are actually following the logic of omnipotence. And what we ought to do is get rid of the idea of omnipotence altogether. Then in the final chapter, I turn to my alternative. If God is not omnipotent, but also not impotent, propose that we understand God's power in light of God's uncontrolling love. And I coin a word, amipotence. AMI meaning love in Latin, and potence meaning power. God's power is the power of uncontrolling love. And I talk some about what it might mean to begin with God's love and let love shape the way we understand God's other attributes, especially how we understand God's power. The latter half of that chapter, I really get sort of nitty gritty in exploring what divine action might mean if God is a universal, personal, loving spirit who can't control anyone or anything. So that's my big proposal to replace omnipotence. Now, given that the process tradition has been best known for questioning omnipotence, rejecting omnipotence, I thought having Trip, Don, and Donna here to talk about those things as process thinkers would be especially valuable. And I'd like for Don to kind of pick it up from here and talk some about Charles Hartshorne. Charles Hartshorne was a 20th century philosopher who, you think my title of my book might be provocative, The Death of Omnipotence. He had a book called Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, and was known for rethinking God's power. Don is a retired professor at Pittsburgh in Kansas, the state of Kansas. Taught philosophy there for a long, long time. I don't have your bio in front of me at the moment, Don. Sorry, I don't have the details. But he's an expert not only on Hartshorne, but also on Whitehead and other philosophers. And Don, would you mind picking it up from here and talking a little bit about how Hartshorne understood the issues of God's power and why he didn't like omnipotence?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show, Trip. I appreciate it. And thanks, Tom, for writing the book. I read this book this last week, and I was reminded of one of my favorite films, The Princess Bride. There's a scene, where the Inigo Montoya and Vizzini and Fettig, they've all captured Buttercup, and they're being chased by a masked pirate. But he keeps evading their attempts for them to get away from him. And so Bassini keeps saying, inconceivable, inconceivable. And Inigo Montoya finally says, I do not think that word means what you think it means. And that's the way I had, that was my impression as I read Tom's book, because there's a chapter where you talk about all the ways that omnipotence gets qualified. And at the end, you wonder, does any theologian really understand, after you string together all those God cannots, what is left? Does anyone really understand what it means? The other impression I had when I was reading the book is it seemed like I was visiting an old friend, or maybe I should say an old mentor, because the friend would be Charles Hartshorne. He lived to be 103 years old. And I knew him, I started reading his work, I guess, 1979, late 1979, and then thereafter. And I knew him and corresponded with him for the last 20 years of his life. So as I read Tom's book, I thought, wow, all of this sounds all very familiar. I want to read one quote from Hartshorne that shows his affinity with Tom's way of thinking. He says, this is from a book that I edited that Hartshorne would have published, but did not. It was written in the 1980s. It's called Creative Experiencing. And he says, the long reign of the worship of naked power is over for some of us. I grew up in a religion of love and in the belief, it was my father's belief, that God is love in eminent form. Is God ideally powerful? Yes, but in exactly the sense in which love is eminent or ideal form is also power in ideal form. The key is love, not power. We should not worship God because besides divine love, there is also divine power. It is the love that explains the power, not vice versa.
Mm.
Now, Tom gives a name to this. He calls it amipotence, which I'm still wrapping my tongue around. But yeah, I like the word. So yeah, what was when you wrote the book? When Hartshorne wrote the book Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, what did he have in mind actually? He a lot of the things that Tom says actually. I was listening for myself how many agreements there were between the two, and that I could document. And I came up with, I've got a list of 18, actually, 18 agreements between between Tom and Hartshorne, many of them on the question of omnipotence. So, for example, he denied creation ex nihilo, which Tom also does. But he also denied that God could unilaterally determine what any particular creature does or any particular event. One of the arguments he gives is that first of all, there are some situations in that no single being could, in principle, bring about. Consider, this is my favorite example, consider the love between Ruth and Naomi. Ruth and Naomi have mutual love. Well, that requires Ruth and it requires Naomi. Now, so the situation of mutual love, which could have been something different, it could be, well, there's unrequited love, one loves the other, but the other one doesn't return the love, or maybe they hate each other, they're indifferent to each other. There's all kinds of different ways that we relate to one another, but they all require more than one individual to bring about. Now, Hartshorne says, suppose you replace one of those with God. Suppose you say, well, God loves Ruth and Ruth loves God. Well, you've still got at least two actors in this case. Forget the billions of people on the planet, but you've still got two actors acting, and it takes both of them to bring about the situation of mutual love, even if you accept Tom's premise that God is essentially loving. It would still take Ruth's response to that love in order to have mutual love. He says what the theologians did is they took the concept of making, of creating, of deciding. They took those kinds of ideas, they sort of projected them onto the heavens, onto God, and said, well, God has this ability, but in such a way that God can determine, actually say, what Ruth's responses would be, or what Naomi's response would be. And there's this concept, of course, in Aquinas, where God absolutely determines what's going to happen, and yet at the same time, Ruth and Naomi are also determining what happens. So there's sort of two layers of causation. Well, Aquinas thought that was bull talk. Those are some of the ideas that Hartshorne came up with. Maybe I should, though I don't want to take up more time. So I'll stop there for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Don.
Yeah.
For people, I know we've had more people joining as we've been going on. I just want to remind everyone that we'll be talking a lot about omnipotence, and that's because Tom has a brand new book, and the QR code definitely works. And
right.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And so we're kind of getting some initial responses to the book and connection between the different guests here and Tom's book on the table, and then we'll be unpacking it in a conversation. And next, responses from Donna Bowman. Now, if you are regular at Homebrewed Christianity, you know Donna because I come up with reasons to hang out with her on the regular. Some of it is nerdy things that are process things. And then she's taken process work because she works in an interdisciplinary honors college in Arkansas and done it like, oh, how do the communities of artists on textile mills work? And then we also have a shared love for nerdy things. So we've talked about technology, the Matrix, Lord of the Rings, and all that kind of stuff. So basically what I'm saying is another reason to hang out with Donna is great. And then I liked her so much. I'm like, come on, Donna, write one of the homebrewed books. And she wrote the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Being Human. So I can't think of a kind of endorsement I can give a person more than I give Donna and Tom. And now Donna and Tom are going to talk about one of my favorite topics together, the death of omnipotence. It is my favorite thing to die. So anyway, take it away, Donna.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Trip. Hello, everybody watching and listening. So Trip and Tom asked me to kind of come from the other side of the process perspective. There's kind of two big branches in the process world that have given us most of the ideas we work with from a historical perspective. One's Hartshorne and one is Alfred North Whitehead. So I'm going to start with Whitehead and talk a little bit about that stuff that Tom said we don't give very satisfying answers to. Why was Whitehead interested in redefining and reimagining God, especially in terms of power? So for Whitehead, I think one of the reasons he writes a lot around culture, history, science, and kind of what watching the way those things, I'm going to use the word evolve or change, what that tells us at, I would say, a mesoscale, like a middle scale, the human scale, right? Not the macro scale of the universe or the micro scale, but what can we observe on that middle scale of organismic life, organisms, right? Like ourselves and like nature. What can we observe about change that tells us something about the way reality is at its base? So what he thinks is that this philosophical meditations on all these evolutionary processes and changes makes him think that change itself is the underlying reality of the universe, not billiard ball entities going through changes and bouncing off each other, but that, and what we would consider an entity, what we see as a thing, is actually a moment in an ongoing process. And that the interactions between that thing and its past, that thing and the things it interacts with, they actually become part of the thing in the next moment. So instead of billiard balls crashing into each other, you have organisms taking in what's in their environment, whether that be nourishing or poisonous, and making that a part of themselves. And for Whitehead, an important part of that process is that the organism doesn't just react in a kind of physics way, like a deterministic way to its environment. It also exerts causality on its environment and, most importantly, on itself. So Whitehead has this notion that everything self-creates. So my next moment is in an important way made up of my decision in this moment. And that's true at a mesoscale, he thinks, on a human scale, on an animal scale, on a natural scale. He starts to think metaphysically that would make sense to be true on all scales and true at all levels of reality. So he builds up this picture of reality from these quasi-atomic building blocks, and he sees these fundamental entities as processes that build on the previous moment. And the power of self-determination and self-creation is inherent in all existence. So what does that mean for omnipotence, right? It means that there is built into the structure of reality, not by virtue of being created by God in a top-down fashion, but by virtue of this is what all reality is, a power to self-determine, whether that be small in the case of what we would think of as non-organic life or just atomic life or whatever, or whether it be quite significant as in more conscious levels of life. But everything has some power to determine itself. So that right there is a huge limiting factor, right, on the power of God. If the nature of reality is to be self-determining, to be self-creating at some fraction of that next moment, then God can't be all determining and all controlling. All right. So process theologians then see some advantages to this rethinking of God's power, and I'll mention just two. So one, Tom has written about extensively, and I hope you're all familiar with it because Tom has been, I think, the leading voice in bringing this to a large audience and helping them understand it. And that's the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil is the fact that much like that old adage, you can have it cheap, you can have it fast, or you can have it good. You can only have two of those, right? The problem of evil is that you can have an all powerful God, an all knowing God, and an all benevolent God, but not all at the same time, right? At least in that definition of omnipotence that we've got. So the problem of evil arises from having all those attributes attributed to God at the same time, right? So this view of organism that Whitehead puts forward, where we're self-determining processes, it may sound familiar to people who are familiar with the free will defense to the problem of evil. I hear students are aware of this idea that we have free will and that therefore evil comes about because of our decisions, right? But the traditional idea of omnipotence is that God chooses to give us free will and then chooses not to interfere in that free will and therefore lets evil happen. So this is a more robust metaphysical version of this, where you don't have this contingency where God could have done otherwise but didn't, right? Instead, you have this idea that all reality has this power of self-determination, and God, as Tom has often said, God can't, right? God can't control the decisions of free creatures. And I'll mention as well, and Don really brought this up as well, something that really exercises me is the problem of absolute authority. That is, do we share a moral universe with God? Do we share moral responsibility with God? If God is truly omnipotent, and therefore it's difficult to figure out why God isn't all determining, we don't share a moral universe or moral responsibility. God, in fact, determines morality, and God bears all responsibility. And I think absolute authority, as we see all around us, and Don kind of brought up the political angle here, and Tom did as well, as we see all around us, absolute authority is an excuse that many people want to give for doing horrible things. Not even that they are the authority, but just that they're obeying the authority, right? And then the second, or I guess third area that I'll mention where there's an advantage to this view is feminist critiques of omnipotence have been widespread since the mid 20th century. And the feminist critique of omnipotence is that omnipotence projects masculine goals of dominance and masculine means of power and force onto God, right? And that it connects the power to determine and control as the means to accomplish those goals. And, I think Don also brought up creation ex nihilo, and I think that's a fascinating example of that. There's been many feminist critiques of creation ex nihilo as well. So it starts right from the very beginning of how we conceive of God's relationship to the universe. So I want to stop there. I have a couple of other kind of tidbits that maybe Trip will give me a chance to drop in, but that's a good start.
All right. Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Don. And remember, you can go get Tom's book right now. What we're going to do, I want to let Tom have a chance to respond as he heard friends bring both Al and Charlie. I don't know if that's what Whitehead and Hartshorn wanted to, as their friends called them, but bring those two views together in connection with this book. If he has anything he wants to say, and then I have a host of topics, and definitely Donna, feel free to put yours back on the table as well. And Don, it'll be much more conversational, but I'll try to be the voice of the people and make sure to pester for there are a couple doozies of people that read the book before the book release party, and I just feel like anyone with that kind of commitment that's not actually related to Tom. I mean, if your family did it, then it'd be different. But anyway,
Well, I
any
think
responses, Tom?
Yeah, I think I'll start by engaging Donna and kind of ask a question by revealing some of an issue I was wrestling with as I wrote the book. And the issue was how much to bring in the feminist critique. If you look carefully, it's in the footnotes, but it's not prominent. And I know, Donna, you're sensitive to these things and you probably know the literature better than I do, but people like Anna K. Swinters, Catherine Keller, Dorothy Solly, et cetera, have made pretty strong critiques. And there was two things that kind of kept me from really kind of playing the feminist card. And I'd like to have you critique me, Donna, or set me straight or something. One is um, the obvious fact that lots of women think God is omnipotent. And so it's not just a male kind of a thing. But secondly, and probably more important for me, I'm now thinking about non-binary issues and gender as fluid and thinking, okay, now can I continue to have this masculine feminine dichotomy if I think of gender as on some sort of the scale and fluidity there? What do you think of those, Donna? What do you think of those worries that I have?
Well, you've played right into my hands with the
Oh, okay.
things that I wanted to. And also,
Good.
I was just talking about this with students this afternoon,
Yeah.
and this idea of what kind of gendered qualities, and even to the point of pronouns or metaphors, we apply to God. Um, and I one of the things that really resonated with the students was this idea of you don't have to have a binary in order to understand that masculine qualities, which have traditionally been applied to God, are limiting in the sense of understanding the full range of what God can be and how God can relate to us.
Mm.
So I don't think you have to buy into that there's just one other side, right? The feminine side to that. Instead, you can understand that range of fatherhood, kingship, those kind of terms. You can understand that as just a slice of a big spectrum, which encompasses how people relate to each other. The other part that I was, you gave me a chance to talk about was I was sort of like reading around this afternoon to make sure that I was gonna kind of fairly represent some of the people that even you cite in the footnotes of the book. And by the way, side note, it was stunning to me looking at your book how little scholarship there's been on omnipotence per se.
Yes, isn't that wild?
Absolutely
Yeah.
floored me.
Yeah.
But thinking about that and wanting to kind of explore and represent that that side of the critique of omnipotence, I came across a paper, a philosophical paper that argued against feminist critiques, argued against process critiques at the same time of omnipotence. And the argument of this paper was, well, yes, we don't want God to be that way. We don't want God to be dominating and controlling. but that doesn't have anything to do with the truth, right?
Yeah.
Right? Are we engaged in another kind of
Yeah.
projecting our wishes onto God? And my answer to that is that this whole conversation we're having is about coherence,
Mm.
right? Coherence with the kind of experiences that we should trust our own experience as a theological input.
Mm-hmm.
Coherence with science, we talked about that. Coherence with this idea of change, coherence with this idea of development and growth and flourishing. But also that we are talking about worship worthiness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge deal for me personally. I know for a lot of my students. Maybe the universe is ruled by an evil dictator. But if so, we should not bow the knee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that trying to understand not only the God that we actually see and encounter in our spiritual lives, but the kind of God who is worth our loyalty, our trust, our faith, our
Yeah.
belief, our fellowship, our discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's so truth isn't everything.
Mm-hmm.
Health, flourishing, and moral responsibility also come into that.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Thank you. I'm glad I queued you up so nicely. That was excellent. Let me turn to you, Don. Then, I have a question for you instead of a response as well, and that is to ask you to engage a little more on the relationship between omnipotence and creation out of nothing. One of the portions of the book where I'm addressing Hartshorne directly, I came upon an idea that I haven't seen explicitly elsewhere, although it's probably out there and I just missed it. But it was the idea that if Hartshorne is right, that power only makes sense if there's more than one individual. So solitary power makes no sense because power is always in relation to another. So if power only makes sense if there's another to which this power is exerted or influenced or related to, then the idea that God once existed all alone but was powerful makes no sense because there's no other upon which to exert influence. And therefore, if God has no power all alone, God has no power to create something out of nothing. This was the way my mind was working, and I tried to explain it briefly in the book. But what do you think of that line of argument and just the general issues of creation out of nothing related to omnipotence?
I'm always reminded of Hartshorne's statement. He says the concept of omnipotence is not even coherent enough to be false. I think I like that. But as for creation ex nihilo, he says that if you back up and say, okay, according to the tradition, God has this choice. God can either lovingly create the universe or simply be there alone. And Hartshorne raises the question, is the universe valuable in some sense? And it seems like it is. It is a valuable thing. So is the universe plus God, is that sort of more value than just God alone? And if so, then God faces the choice of more value versus less value. Or we might even say God being alone versus God being in communion with the creatures, however that may turn out.
Mm.
And he says, if that were the choice, if that's what classical theism maintains, then it seems that God really doesn't have a choice but to create the universe.
Mm.
But of course, Hartshorne goes the next step, and he thinks that, as you say, power is always power in relation to others with some degree of power
Yeah.
and or creativity. And so, and in connection with what Donna was saying about the organic nature of the world and the way Whitehead thought of it, he thought that not only are we in the world, but the world is in some fashion in us.
Mm.
And when it is in us, we do something about that. We're doing it right now as we speak. So I listen to what you say. I think about it in my brain, and then something comes out of my mouth that hopefully makes sense. So I have done some minor creative act simply in listening and responding to what you say.
Yeah.
And for Hartshorne, that's a model of the way things work. He was fond of sort of tweaking Plato's concept in the Sophist, one of the late dialogues. Plato says basically to be or to exist is to act or to be acted upon. And Hartshorne changes the or to an and. To exist is to act and to be acted upon.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have that's inherent in existence itself. Once you have that, creation ex nihilo is going to go by the wayside.
Yeah.
And there's a final idea about creation ex nihilo that Hartshorne rejects. As I understand creation ex nihilo, it's not that God somewhere back in the past lit the fuse of the universe or lit the fuse of the Big Bang. That's a kind of a deistic, I suppose, idea about creation. Now, for the high theology of Aquinas and Augustine and Maimonides and you name it, Al-Ghazali, they thought of creation ex nihilo in terms of God's creative act actually brings the entire universe from beginning to end into existence. And their model for that was there was an analogy between the circle and the center of the circle. So think of the center of the circle as God. Think of the rim of the wheel as the progress of time. And then the arrows or the spokes of the wheel actually pointing outward are God's creative acts. So God creates the first moment of time. God creates everything in between. God creates the end of it. It's an elegant picture, but ultimately Hartshorne denies it because he thinks that time itself is real. And that means that there is no eternal standpoint from which all of time could be observed or created all at once. So that's another aspect of his denial of creation ex nihilo.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Just on that, the person in the 20th century who picks up that notion of creation as a single act from eternity, from beginning to end, and has made it popular was Karl Barth. And since we happen to have somebody on here who wrote a book about Whitehead and Barth's playing that theme out, and noticing the vigorous smiley nods in the corner, I'd love for Donna to say something.
Good idea.
Excellent.
Well, I was thinking about Barth as we were talking about this idea of whether it's possible to imagine or whether, God can be God if God is alone, right? And the way Barth handles this brilliantly, I think, and an insight that we could take even if we disagree with that notion of solitariness. He treats God's first creative act as an act of self-determination. And God determines to be God for us. That's what Barth says, right? And that God for us means that from a primordial, for Barth, pre-temporal, right? Pre-temporal standpoint, God determines God's self to be in relationship and to be in a relationship of loyalty to the creature, right? So I don't, that's almost a mythological imagining of an existence of God before time. I think we can take that insight that God is God for us and see it as something that Hartshorne and Whitehead are trying to write into the metaphysics of reality, and that Tom Oord is understanding as the only nature that it's possible for God to have. Barth just adds this step of God being self-determining in that way. But we can also take Barth's notion of that divine self-determination and understand it as exactly the kind of self-determination that all organisms get to exercise on themselves. And if we do that, we see that God, in making that determination, makes it in light of inputs from God's past and God's vision of the future and what actually exists around God. So we go back to the Genesis account of creation and the idea of the formless void earth and the waters. And we don't see that God is alone. We see that God has material and an environment, and God determines God's self towards a vision of the future and a vision of creatures that can have meaningful, complex relationships with God. And that's the world we live in.
Awesome.
I like it.
So the earlier you raised the question, Donna, about coherence as being one of the big challenges around omnipotence. And I think one of the things Tom does in the first 2 chapters is show that that process or open relational people regularly point out the problem of evil issue, but that's not the only reason it's incoherent. It also requires you to read the scriptures like tipsy on authoritarian power and run that hermeneutic through it, and then it requires philosophers to, like you pointed out, not actually explain what the word means very often, and when they do, qualify it a whole bunch of ways. And you have that, but then you said, but there's also the coherence right around science, and I think there are a lot of process and open relational types that think a notion of divine action and presence in the world shouldn't be one that problematizes the natural order, but the understanding of the God-world relationship is one that you can kind of have a thicker naturalism without like a supernaturalism. You mentioned experience and worship worthiness, and I think all those are there. But the thing that popped in my head when you said all that is Whitehead and Hartshorne both have these other images that go that they ground their coherence in. Whitehead at the end of Process and Reality, like where does he begin to work things out is from the Galilean vision. You get all this beautiful poetry about the very kind of power in Jesus. Like you said earlier, Don, you said that it's love that explains the power, right? So part of the coherence in both Whitehead and Hartshorne, and what Tom, I think, does in the last chapter in stating positively this vision of love is to say something like, I'm not just wanting a coherent vision for biblical reasons or philosophical reasons or evil reasons. Like there's a positive reason, and it's the thing that is compelling about love, or it's the thing that is compelling about what Jesus said, did, and endured. What do you like? How do y'all see that? Because they obviously have these different lines, but for me, I think in my experience, lots of people ask one of the questions in chapters 1, 2, or 3, but for those that find their home in this space, it's the last chapter where you start smiling and go, "Oh, that is so beautiful!" And it hums with truth. It has that coherence where our experience and science and worship worthiness is there, and especially for Christians, I think you see how it's nested in the life and ministry of Jesus.
Beautiful. Donna, you guys want to comment on that?
I'll say a word about it. Tom, years ago, the two of us were at a conference in Kentucky, and it was filled. It was a Society of Christian Philosophers, Asbury, maybe that's where it was.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
And I think we were rooming together that time, and there were panelists at the final symposium. The main speakers, I remember. William Hasker was up there, and Thomas Flint, and I can't quite remember who else was up there.
I think Michael Rea was there.
Yeah, Michael Rea. Yeah, that's right. Well, you raised a question. There must have been 500 people there. I mean, in that audience, and you raised this wonderful question. You said, Hartshorne recently in the Library of Living Philosophers volume on his thought, the philosophy of Charles Hartshorne. Hartshorne says that his intuitive clue in philosophy is the love of God and the God of love.
Hmm.
And as it turns out, that's you can document that from the very beginning of his thought to the very end. So that he was right. That's his intuitive clue. And then you asked the panelist, what's your intuitive? And I thought it was interesting that William Hasker agreed with Hartshorne, basically. He said, yeah, love. William Hasker defends an open theistic view that's kind of second cousin to process thought. But Flint and Rhea, I think Flint said that it was the authority of the church.
Yep, he did. Yep.
That was his intuitive clue.
Yeah.
And I think Rhea might have said the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, maybe Donna, your colleague down there in Arkansas, Sanders.
John
I think
Sanders,
was he there? Well, I can't
he
remember.
was. Yep, he was on that panel. Yep.
And I think he said love of God too.
He did.
So the two open theists, like I said, who are second cousins to process thought, they said love was the ultimate intuitive clue. So the love explains the power and actually everything else. It is what is primary, and if you contradict that, then you might as well be an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll say a word in praise of the deconstructing chapters 1 through 3, and not just the reconstructing chapter 4, which Tripp has called out as really beautiful and a positive foundation. I think it's really important for people picking up a book like this to understand that what they've always taken to be central to the tradition is, in fact, has an alienness to it.
Mm.
And it reminds me of one of my absolute favorite books of philosophy of all time, David Hume's Natural History of Religion.
Oh, yeah.
Just a terrific book, a hilarious book, actually. Philosophy can be very funny at times. But he really shows that omnipotence comes about not as a result of coherence to our experience, but as a result of rivalries between loyalties to different gods and the flattery that worshipers heap upon their gods, making them more and more and more powerful until finally they are the only God and they are all powerful. And I think that is a concept that's born out of a kind of competition. Now, competition is something that we do see as part of our world, but isn't it fantastic that more and more we are understanding our world and the natural world around us and the universe around us in terms of balances and collaborations. I think about the way we've learned about networks of tree roots, right? Exchanging nutrients, not competing for each other to dominate, but working for the health of the whole forest. That's crazy. And it's on an entire ecosystem scale. So what makes us think that a concept that's born out of competition for whose God can be the best is something that actually describes something real on the one hand, but also something that has any relevance to our lives. It's not true to our experience, and it's not true to our tradition. And I think the natural history of the concept that you outline biblically and philosophically in those chapters, it's really important to have that deconstructed for people.
Thanks. Yeah.
There's a wonderful example of that in Conan the Barbarian, the film, where Conan and his friend Subutai, they're out on the prairie and they're talking. And Subutai says, what god do you worship? And Conan says, I worship Crom, and when I go before him, I'll have to answer the riddle of steel. And Subutai says, my God is greater than your God. My God is the everlasting sky, and your God, Crom, lives underneath my God. Isn't there a kind of one-upmanship in Genesis as well, where all the things that people worshipped as God, they might have worshipped the sun, or they might have worshipped certain animals. No, this God created those things.
Well, I think that's been very typical in not
Mhm.
only Christianity, but in other traditions of trying to pay God the best metaphysical compliments you can possibly give God. And by the time you get done, you end up with a God who I say in one of the chapters is too big. That is, you've given all of these things to God that are metaphysical attributes that are to the nth degree, and they don't cohere. To take it back to Donna's point, and especially they don't fit well with the God of love. So what I'm trying to do in this book is start with love and then understand these other metaphysical the attributes of God in light of it.
Mhm. There was a question. It was emailed in, and then someone else has asked it differently already in the chat. And since it came up about since Don, I don't forget what was the line that open theists are. We're like process,
Second cousins
uh,
to
which
process this.
yeah, which in Arkansas, where Sanders and Donna were, would be kissing cousins, second cousins. Let's see. But just to be clear, my family's from Arkansas as well. So it was Gurdon, Arkansas was where the Fullers are from. Anyway, but the person that emailed had said, could you each of you come up with one thing you think is an important difference between the two? And because in most parts, of our especially in the academy, we end up being allies in lots of places. But in what ways what's a difference that each of you think is important?
Donna, you want to start?
Sure. I think that open theism. Now Tom is more in the world of open theism. That's sort of where you come from originally, and so you have to critique my answer here.
All right.
Open theism, I think of as an attempt to reform a fundamentally evangelical uh, version of God, theology, and relationship to the Bible. So, in a sense, it comes out of a tradition that it affirms a lot of things out of that tradition, but it says we've got this one thing wrong, and it is actually a very major thing. This understanding that the future is all determined, and we are racing towards an already written apocalypse of some kind, and that is actually unhealthy for us in understanding our relationship to God, the value of life on earth, what we can do in order to solve our problems, what our responsibility is for that. So I see it as a reaction and an attempt at reformation, an attempt to solve a problem within that evangelical world. Whereas I see process thought, again, coming out of Whitehead and Hartshorne, seeing problems, but those problems come up in a much more philosophical realm. And in response to that, there's an attempt to build a metaphysics from the ground up that it is in response to those problems, but I would say it's separate and applicable to all kinds of different spheres people work in, and it's not quite as rigidly directed at one tradition, which we're trying to fix.
Awesome. What about you, Don?
I'm reminded of Richard Rice's book, 1980, called The Openness of God. And that's Richard did his dissertation with Hartshorne, or on Hartshorne, and Hartshorne actually wrote a foreword to it. The dissertation was never published. Richard was nice enough to share the foreword with me. But that phrase, openness of God, he got that from Hartshorne. Hartshorne, if you look in Wisdom's Moderation, you'll find it there in one of the early articles. So Hartshorne is the one who comes up with this concept of openness. So I'm kind of perverse in thinking of open theism as the umbrella term. I'm probably fighting a losing battle by saying that. But I think, and what by openness, I mean that God is open to creaturely influence and necessarily so. So, and that's a process view, and some open theists accept that idea as well. Or sometimes they'll say God voluntarily opens himself up to, or herself up to, influence from the creatures. But then I would agree with Donna that it comes from an evangelical perspective that wants to make better sense of the biblical witness and to get rid of the toxic concepts of omnipotence, but also of omniscience considered as a absolutely detailed knowledge of everything that will happen.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. But if I was to sort of pick out something you both haven't emphasized very much, I might start by saying, first of all, I think we all agree that there are many versions of process thought. There are also many versions of openness thought. But if we ask those who self-identify as open theists and those who self-identify as process theists, the question of omnipotence would be one of the things that distinguishes them. Most openness folks will want to affirm some kind of view of omnipotence, and most process folks won't. But they agree that God is loving. They agree that God moves through time and the future is undetermined. They affirm free will. But one of the differences that isn't usually talked about is that most openness folks reserve that free will for humans or complex creatures. They don't think so much about an ontology or metaphysics that has some kind of agency and indeterminacy top to bottom, and therefore, when they read the scriptures, they got no problem God luring free will creatures or persuading or calling. But a lot of openness folks want to appeal to omnipotence to part the Red Sea or to, do these kind of more nature miracles. Whereas I think the process tradition, because it thinks of agency and creation top to bottom, it's got some resources to account for those miracles without having to appeal to omnipotence. And so that's one of the differences between the two.
Mm-hmm. So my note taking while I gave that, I find this interesting because you first emphasized, Donna, how open theists tend to be confessionally centered, and that shapes the way you do your discourse thinking, and the way imagination functions in a confessional tradition is different than a philosophical one, which is the process conversation tends to be there. And then I thought about the difference between with the energy for them when they deal with their peers, right? An open theist looks at their peers and asks, like, have you read the Bible? No, I mean, like the Bible, right? Like Tom will get up and say, if anyone can find me one verse in the whole Bible where God does something without the cooperation of a creature, I got $500 for you. And he said it to thousands of people, and they have not got the money from him yet, right? But if you are with process people and you're talking to your philosophy of religion friends, you say, like, have you even included your own experience in the version of the world you're talking about? Like, I don't think, like, you're a sensationalist for no reason. You aren't one, but you're a Humean sensationalist. You've now, we all know how that works. And you sit there looking at your friend who has 4 books on Kant with a straight face telling you how it works. And then you're like, yes, but when we get done, we're going to go drink together, tell jokes, and then we're going to sing some when a karaoke goes, and you don't have a quality account of how you fit the enjoyment of that, and unless you give me the third critique, but then that undoes the first one in the strict way you're trying, and that's what the philosophers have. And when you start doing that, the open theists are like, this is what happens when people don't believe the Bible. And when the open theists are just like, no, it says God repents, and the process person's like, it does? Great, I'll tell my fundamentalist students. And I actually think the fun part of everyone being friends is you get the benefit of people that have a different discourse that grounds them, and deep values they find discovered in different conversations. And so now there are people we would have a hard time deciding who's who. I had people review my dissertation and tell me it was open theist, and others tell me it was process, and it all depended on how they decided. I'm sure y'all have had similar experiences. In the last thing there you said, Tom, about the question of freedom, I had not heard it put that way, but I think you're saying that open theists are saying, oh, no, we need freedom for genuine ethical responsibility. Like the moral universe of faith before a loving, good God does not work without freedom.
Right.
And the process types tend to get there going, no, freedom's in nature. Like, what are you, like, why are you all having philosophical accounts of the world that denies your actual experience of existence? And okay, maybe you thought that made sense in the 19th century, but welcome to the 20th century. Come on, but then the freedom is for nature because you couldn't imagine yourself not in it. But but they both, because they're grounded differently, you see this energy function and play out in different conversation partners. But anyway, that's one of the reasons I love everyone hanging out at gatherings, because they have different intuitions. And Tom, I think you're great at bringing so many of them together, which is how you see it in the book.
I want to bring up this idea of miracles, because I think that is a big part of why people are hesitant about exploring omnipotence and problems with it. They need a God who can do miracles, and miracles are a big part of the Bible. I had a friend of a friend say the other day something that has really stuck with me. I want to throw it on the table. Eric Seibert, who I met at Tom's retreat last year, came to my university to talk a couple of weeks ago, and talked about how if we do not understand the grief of the Egyptians whose firstborn were killed, and the wives of the charioteers who were thrown into the sea, then we are we are failing to reckon with the whole Bible, the whole thing we have. And this friend of a friend said, in response to me bringing this up, that there's a saying they heard, a wetland is just a swamp somebody loves. And they said, I think maybe a miracle is just a disaster somebody loves. And I haven't been able to get that one out of my head.
Yeah, that is a tough one. I mean, I want to say miracles happen and God has an essential role in them, but I would define miracles in such a way that miracles only point to something that is good overall. Of course, there can be always negative aspects in something that happens that might be good overall, but still some loss there. I think Whitehead would talk about tragedy. I do, though, think that one of the advantages of thinking about miracles from a process perspective is it helps us to avoid what I typically hear from an evangelical and what I typically hear from a mainline liberal Christian. The typical evangelical thinks that in order to account for, I don't know, Jesus healing someone, you have to have omnipotence. And I want to say, well, no, you do need to have God acting, but there can be some cooperation, both at the mental level, the cellular level, societal level, etc. Or in the case of inanimate objects that might not be able to cooperate kind of intentionally, the conditions of creation have to be conducive for this miracle. So you don't need that omnipotence. But then what the liberal or mainline folks who aren't process folks have typically done is they've taken all the miracles and just kind of said, well, they never happened. They're not really real. They're just there to tell a story. And maybe that's true of some of them. But I think the process tradition can go a long ways to giving an actual realistic account of the way creation and God can interact to bring about surprisingly good things that we call miracles. So we can sort of avoid omnipotence, but also avoid having to say, all the miracles are just myths that are teaching us some sort of pedagogical purpose.
Yeah. So, um, there, there are two questions from our people that pre-read your book that I think would be fun, and all of you will probably take it different ways. And one of them is about divine action. Now, in the book, it's on page 137. So it's just a short quote. I'll read it, but and this is in the chapter, the constructive chapter at the end. You say, we cannot. You're summing up the chapter. You say we cannot perceive an invisible God with our five senses. We may infer the Spirit's activities, however, from what we observe in the world. We can directly detect the Spirit's activity through non-sensory perception. Although we can never fully or accurately describe our interactions with God, our experience with the Spirit is real. So this individual's question was, I get the critique of omnipotence. I'm thrilled to let it go. But why is God necessary, and why is it not just nature naturing this process? And like having people that having philosophers here, I think we all know people in the process family who take the naturing option, or varieties of process naturalisms as well. And so maybe Tom, you can give your own answer, but I think it'd be fun to hear how each of us respond to that kind of provocation. Like, yeah, omnipotence is a horrible idea to attach to God, but why keep God?
Yeah. I don't mind you guys going first if you have a response ready to go, and I can fill in whatever you haven't talked about. Donna, you look like you're ready to go.
Well, I can start from the Whiteheadian perspective here, which is that for Whitehead, God is a necessary part of the explanation for why reality is what it is, because God injects and provides purpose and direction um, to the processes that make up everything. We're not all pulling in the same direction. Um, that's inevitable because we have that power to self-determine. But to Whitehead, it was remarkable how much pulling in the same direction there was. One example of that would be the development of more and more complexity that has more and more emergent properties that eventually becomes consciousness, and that there's something beyond that, something after that, maybe many things after that, that Whitehead would think we're headed towards. He sees self-determining entities as chaotic if there is not some way to inject directionality and purpose, which the entity can accept or reject, or modify, right? But he doesn't see any other way for it to get in there. And so that's his answer.
Well, Tom, do you want me to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I had the same question that the person who read the book had after I read the book. I thought, well, okay, Tom, you've really eviscerated omnipotence, and you've given us a really nice alternative. But then why bother with God? What difference would that make if we just eliminated God and said, let's all try to be kind to each other and create the best overall well-being for all the creatures on the planet and all the creatures that we know? And I think for Hartshorne, but also for me, it is a question of an adequate metaphysic that would that would speak to my experience and not just to my logical mind, although I wanted to speak to that as well. But then I think of logic as a sort of a subcategory of aesthetics and ultimately of ethics as well. So for Hartshorne, he's best known maybe for the ontological, sort of resurrecting the ontological argument. In fact, what he did, he never believed that the argument was sufficient in and of itself to prove that God exists. In fact, he thought that with a medieval or classical concept of God, that you could actually get the non-existence of God out of an ontological argument. So he felt like it was necessary to develop a coherent concept of God in order to even consider the argument seriously. But he thought that what the argument does do is it shows, he calls it Anselm's discovery, God cannot exist contingently. If that is true, if God's existence cannot be contingent, then the only two alternatives are a necessarily existing God versus one that is logically impossible. You don't have the concept of God who might or might not exist. Donna mentioned Hume's Natural History of Religion, and man, I really agree with you. That is one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite Hume book. But he makes the point that polytheism is a kind of atheism, and the reason he thinks that is because all of these gods have a kind of contingent existence, and it really, there's stories about the births of the gods, like Hesiod's theogony. But the God of the high religions is one who has no beginning and has no end. Now, Hartshorne thinks that leads you to a necessarily existing God. There's a technical question there that I'm not going to go into, but the idea is your options are necessary existence, impossible existence. Hartshorne adds to that, importantly, something that Tom also accepts, which is that in God, there is a distinction between what you might call the character of God, or the essence/existence of God, and the actuality of God, which would be God's particular experiences of the world. So if you have a woman listening to a bird, we'll use an example that would be dear to Hartshorne's heart. He was a ornithologist of some merit. And so you have a woman listening to a bird. Well, she exists as listening to the bird. You can infer from her listening to the bird that she has the capacity to listen. You could call that part of her essence. And you can also infer that she exists. But you can't go the other way. You can't infer from her existence alone that she has the capacity to hear the bird or that she's actually listening to the bird. And likewise, you cannot infer from her mere capacity to hear the bird that she is actually listening to a bird. So there's an asymmetry between existence, essence or character, and actuality. So Hartshorne says the abstract aspect of God is the essence, existence. The concrete aspect, which actually includes the essence, existence, is actuality of God. I think you need all of that in order to get a tenable theism. Why do you need it? Well, as I say, I think it comes down to, well, do you think that you've got some argument or reason to think that God is impossible?
Yeah, I like that. All right, so I hear the question is kind of like, why should you believe in God? And the usual response to that by philosophers of religion is to look at certain arguments for the existence of God. One of the arguments that plays a major role in most traditions is the argument that sometimes called the cosmological argument of why is there something rather than nothing? And the traditional answer is, well, there is a God who created the world out of nothing, and it all goes back to God. We don't buy that because we don't have creation out of nothing. Now, we can still make a cosmological argument based on metaphysical ultimates, but I'm going to set that aside just for a moment. There's another argument that Donna points to that has something to do with the purpose or orientation of reality. And here I like that line. I don't know who said it first, but Martin Luther King made it famous. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, or something like that. And the point is that there seems to be some kind of pull again, a word I think Donna used, pull toward something better. And the word God is what many people would use to talk about that kind of pull. I find that argument helpful. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but I think it's an important one. Another is this sense of morality and values. Now, you don't have to have a God to have morality and values. I'm not saying that. But this notion that there is some kind of a pull or persuasion toward the best, toward the most beautiful, toward the most helpful. Where does that come from? It seems like the evolutionary process in itself doesn't account for this, because sometimes evolution would suggest that we do things differently than this kind of pull that we're feeling toward something more beautiful. But I want to kind of put a little more weight on than most people would. In fact, most people wouldn't even bring it up. Charles Hartshorne did, however, and that is the notion that the ultimate meaning of life seems to have some kind of mind for which we might place that meaning. And not just the ultimate meaning for life, but my own life. Does my life have ultimate meaning? Does what I do really make a difference ultimately? Well, if there is a God, and if that God is affected by what I do moment by moment, then even after I die, my life will be in the divine life and, in some sense, make a real contribution to the ultimate significance of reality. I think that's actually a pretty good reason to think there is a God. Not a proof, but a reason that I find very plausible.
Can I add, Tom, to that in the early goings in 1970, when he wrote Creative Synthesis, Hartshorne called this series of arguments, this kind of cumulative argument, he called them proofs. But later on, he thought, no, that's a bad word, because there's no such thing as a knockdown proof of God's existence. But he did argue from a cumulative case.
Did he also call it the global argument or something like that?
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Donna, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just the way you kind of phrase that, which I think is really beautiful and appropriately sort of humble, reminds me of Peter Berger's lovely book, A Rumor of Angels, where he is so careful to say there's just these things that point. They are not proofs, but the fact that we have to tell children it will all be okay, even though we can't know that. The fact that that's built into the fabric of being a human being, that has to be said and has to be at some point, in some sense, believed and communicated. It doesn't prove that everything will be okay, but it points outside of what we can prove, what we can know. And he lists a bunch of these signposts that point outside what we can know for sure. And I find that very, very lovely. And
doesn't he call them something like indications of transcendence or
intimations? I think he calls them, right?
Yeah,
intimations of transcendence. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, book.
It is. All right. I'll just go ahead and go to the last question since I'm catching time. Here's a fun one. Okay. Tom invented a word and put it on the cover of a book. What is another word that a thinker invented that their friends probably looked at them and are like, really? You're making a word up? And then now we've all gone in debt so that we can tell other people that they too should learn this word. This is the proleptic moment at the book release that 20 years from now, there's someone that's just now being conceived that's going to be in a philosophy class for their senior capstone. And she's going to say, I want to write on omnipotence. Well, does anyone have a favorite word someone invented at some point? They don't have, it doesn't have to be on the book cover though.
A favorite fake word.
Yes.
A coinage. Well, I just got to say that I'm glad we're calling this out, because I think Tom has like the cojones on this man. It's just like I think he had to go found an entire publishing house just so nobody would say no to him, to make up a word and put it on the cover of a book. It's truly amazing.
I love it.
Oh my.
Oh.
You mean just any old word, Trip?
Yeah, someone invented. Yeah, like I mean, Whitehead has a ton of them. But I would think prehension is the most important vocab addition for Whitehead. All the others kind of flow out of it. And it's fun to say. It's easier to spell than concrescence. And once you start putting the word hybrid in front of different things, people get confused. You know, if you add a dash in your invented word, that's all, you only get partial credit. If you,
I think the best one is Nexus with the diacritical mark over the
ooh,
That is
if you
true,
get a
yeah.
diacritical in, you really
That's impressive.
Heidegger just started using a strike through, like in the printed version.
There's actually 2 words invented in this book, and
Uh-oh.
I don't think people probably knew about the second word, but I'm pretty sure it's an invention on my part.
You
The
just didn't put
word,
it on the cover?
the word is dictyocide, to kill a word. I was looking like crazy in like the Latin and trying to figure out what to put that together. I don't think that's a word anyone has used before this book. So 2
Well,
words.
we're all looking forward to the sequel, Dictyocide by Thomas Jay Oord. They're like, he killed omnipotence, now he's killing the word, you know, and they're like, what is this? His anti-Christology?
But on a serious note, I mean, that word amipotence really has been picked up pretty quickly, and people are like, it's almost like people were looking for a word. I'm not saying it's going to, take over the world, but there's lots of people who have found it attractive as a word they can kind of point to. So who knows?
Have you ever heard of desobritization?
Ooh.
It's akin to demythologization, Boltzmann's idea.
Mm.
Desobritization is to divest the New Testament or even the Old Testament of to divest the interpretive strategies that are brought to those books of their excessive sobriety, to find the humor that is there.
Oh,
Never heard
that's
of it.
fun.
Yep. Desobritization. Too ugly to be word too ugly to be stolen.
Listen, these words, like the scholarly words they get out, and one of the things that's really struck me about the last few years is that the word deconstruction, which is this philosophical word that we've been kicking around for decades, is out in the world and is being used to describe a very particular process in people's religious lives, and I find that mind-blowing.
Yeah, I always thought of it as, Derrida and that whole tradition, but now it has a whole life of its own. I mean, it's not totally devoid of Derrida, but it's not the same.
Yeah, you don't even have to say it in a French accent anymore.
Resentment.
Yeah.
Resentment.
Yeah. Well, this has been a lot of fun. And I'm really glad we got to do this. For all of you that are on here, you should totally go get Tom's book. You can even use that QR code, but don't worry. The internet, if you just type it in, will tell you how you too can go get Tom's new book and enjoying the funeral for omnipotence, because it's overrated and it's not necessary. Lots
We
of
need a dirge or
qualifications.
something in the background here. Some
Second line, and New Orleans second line, really.
There you go. Hey, Trip, I want to thank you for hosting this. This has been a lot of fun. Donna and Don, thank you. I mean, conversation I think has been really rich. So Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah.
It's so fun to hang out with Don, especially. It's been too long.
Yes, it has.
Awesome. Well, we will see you all later. Those of you that showed up late, don't worry, it'll all be on the internet, on the podcast, and the video will be up on YouTube once it finishes processing. So thank you.
Thanks to everybody who left remarks in the column there, whatever the chat box. I've enjoyed reading through those as we've gone through the evening.
All righty.